Welcome to this deep dive, at the intersection of Buddhism, psychology, and evolution.
Okay.
We'll be looking at Robert Wright's book, Why Buddhism Is True,
hmm
which argues that Buddhism's ancient wisdom is actually supported by modern science.
Yeah, it's a fascinating premise,
Yeah.
right? Suggests that while Buddhism developed centuries ago, its insights into the human mind are surprisingly relevant to our understanding of the brain and behavior today.
So we're not just talking about meditation and mindfulness here,
Right.
but a deeper look at how our minds work, maybe even why we struggle in certain ways.
Yeah,
The book really delves into how evolution might have set us up for some challenges when it comes to happiness.
exactly. The book's core idea is that evolution designed our brains for survival and reproduction,
Okay.
not necessarily for lasting happiness. It's a bit like a cosmic prank, where we're programmed to chase fleeting pleasures that don't actually lead to fulfillment.
That reminds me of those late night cravings for junk food.
Mm.
It's not good for you, but that dopamine rush is so tempting.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Our brains are wired to anticipate pleasure, and that anticipation often overpowers the actual experience. You crave the donut, imagine its deliciousness,
Oh, yeah.
but the reality rarely lives up to the hype.
And then you end up wanting another donut and another and another.
Right.
It's like you're running on a treadmill, working hard, but getting nowhere.
That's exactly what Buddhists call the hedonic treadmill. We constantly chase pleasure, thinking it's the key to happiness, but the satisfaction is fleeting,
Right.
and we're left craving more. This cycle, according to Buddhist teachings, is a major source of suffering, or dukkha.
It's interesting how this ancient concept aligns with modern psychology and neuroscience. We're learning more and more about the brain's reward system and how it can lead us down this path of seeking but never quite finding true contentment.
And what's even more fascinating is that understanding the evolutionary basis of the hedonic treadmill doesn't automatically free us from it.
That's where Wright's personal experience comes in, right?
Yes.
Even after he intellectually grasped why we crave, he still felt trapped by the cycle.
Yes. He realized that knowledge alone wasn't enough. It's like knowing how a trap works doesn't prevent you from getting caught.
So if knowing isn't enough, what did Wright turn to in his quest for a more lasting form of happiness?
That's where his exploration of meditation begins, and that's what we'll dive into in the next part of our deep dive.
So Wright was stuck on this hedonic treadmill, even after, understanding it intellectually.
Great.
That's where he turned to meditation. And his experience at a silent retreat is really fascinating.
He went all in.
Oh, wow.
A whole week of nothing but meditation. No talking, no distractions, just him and his thoughts.
Yeah,
It's a pretty intense way to confront the inner workings of your mind.
I can imagine. Was he instantly enlightened?
Not quite. He described struggling at first,
Go ahead.
finding it hard to focus. His mind was constantly buzzing with thoughts, just like most people experience when they first try meditation.
So what's the secret? Is it about emptying your mind completely?
Actually, mindfulness meditation isn't about stopping thoughts altogether. It's more about learning to observe those thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's about recognizing that you are not your thoughts.
That sounds tricky.
Yeah.
How do you separate yourself from your own thoughts?
That's where the concept of the modular mind comes in.
Okay.
This idea, which has gained traction in psychology and neuroscience, suggests that our minds aren't one unified entity, but are made up of specialized units almost like mini-minds that drive our behavior.
So instead of one big me in control,
Right.
there's a whole committee operating behind the scenes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And many of these modules operate on a subconscious level, influencing our thoughts, feelings, and actions without us even realizing it. Think of the fear module, for example. It's designed to keep us safe by triggering a fight or flight response when we sense danger.
Right, like when you jump at a sudden noise or feel your heart race when you think you see a snake in the grass.
Exactly. But sometimes this fear module can overreact, triggering anxiety even when there's no real threat. Mindfulness meditation helps us become aware of these modules in action. It's like shining a light on the inner workings of our minds.
So instead of being swept away by a wave of fear, you can observe it,
Yes,
recognize it as the fear module doing its thing, and choose how to respond.
precisely. It's about creating space between you, the observer, and the thoughts and feelings that arise. This detachment is a key step in breaking free from those automatic, often unhelpful patterns.
That makes sense. It's like those thoughts and feelings are guests passing through your mental house. You can acknowledge them, offer them tea, but you don't have to let them take over.
And Wright's conversation with Joseph Goldstein, a well-known meditation teacher, really highlighted this point. Goldstein described how meditation helped him see thoughts as arising from these different modules. Instead of feeling like, I am angry, it became anger is arising.
That's a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. It helps create that distance between you and the emotion, allowing you to experience it without being completely controlled by it.
Yes, and this leads us to the fascinating concept of the not-self experience, which is a core principle in Buddhist thought. It's about recognizing that the sense of a solid, unchanging self is actually an illusion.
Now that sounds really mind-bending. How can there be no self? Wouldn't we cease to function without a sense of who we are?
Well, it's not about denying that we exist, but rather questioning the nature of that existence. The not-self concept suggests that what we perceive as ourself is actually a collection of constantly changing thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've talked about the hedonic treadmill and, how our brains are wired for survival, not necessarily happiness.
Right.
Then we explore this idea of the modular mind and how meditation can help us observe those thoughts and feelings without being consumed by them. But this idea of not self, that's where things start to get really intriguing.
It's a challenging concept, for sure.
Yeah.
But Wright argues that it's not just some esoteric Buddhist idea. It actually has roots in our understanding of the brain and evolution.
So how does this not self idea work?
Right.
Are we supposed to believe that we don't really exist?
It's not about denying the reality of our experience, but rather challenging the notion of a solid, unchanging self.
Yeah.
Wright actually describes two types of not-self experiences.
Okay.
Interior and exterior. The interior not-self is about recognizing that specific thoughts and feelings are not inherently you. You can observe them, acknowledge them, but you don't have to identify with them.
So it's not I am angry, but anger is arising.
Exactly.
So those thoughts and feelings are happening within you,
Yeah.
but they aren't the entirety of who you are.
Exactly. And this makes sense when you consider the modular mind. If those thoughts and feelings are arising from these different modules,
Right.
then it's easier to see them as separate from a core self. Mindfulness helps us become aware of this process, creating space between us and the thoughts and feelings that arise.
And Wright provides some really compelling personal examples of this in the book. He talks about how during meditation he was able to let go of tension in his body, even though he was highly caffeinated.
He also describes how he was able to transform the sensation of tooth pain into a neutral feeling simply by observing it without attaching to it. And he even used these techniques to reduce his performance anxiety before a big public speaking event.
These anecdotes really demonstrate the power of this shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It's not about denying the physical or emotional sensations, but rather changing your relationship to them.
Now, the exterior not self is a bit more radical.
Okay.
It involves a feeling of the boundaries dissolving between you and the world around you, leading to a sense of interconnectedness.
Wow, that sounds almost mystical. Is there a scientific basis for this kind of experience?
Wright connects this experience to the Buddhist concept of tanha, which translates to craving and is seen as the root of suffering. Craving creates this sense of I needing something outside of myself, reinforcing a separation between self and other.
So the more we crave things, the more we build up this wall between ourselves and the world.
Yes. And the philosopher Susan al-Bahari argues that by overcoming aversion, which is a form of craving,
Okay.
we can start to experience that exterior not-self, that feeling of interconnectedness.
Wright illustrates this with a funny anecdote about resisting the urge to kill a snoring man during a meditation retreat.
Instead of being consumed by anger and frustration, he was able to observe those feelings without letting them control him. It's a humorous example,
Right.
but it highlights how mindfulness can help us weaken the boundaries between ourselves and others.
So by letting go of our cravings and aversions, we can start to see ourselves as part of something larger than just our individual selves.
And this brings us to another core Buddhist teaching, the concept of emptiness, which Wright argues is actually supported by evolutionary psychology.
Wait, how does evolution tie into emptiness?
Well, our brains are wired to project essence onto things based on their perceived relevance to our survival. A juicy steak, for example, appears full of essence because our brains know it's packed with nutrients that are crucial for survival.
But Wright argues that this projection of essence is ultimately an illusion.
Exactly. He uses the example of people reacting differently to a simple tape measure, depending on whether it belonged to JFK or a random plumber. The object is the same,
Right.
but the story we attach to it changes our perception of its value and importance.
It's like our brains are constantly creating narratives,
Yes.
and those narratives shape our reality.
And this is where Wright's interview with a seasoned meditator named Gary Weber gets really interesting. Weber claims to experience the world largely without those stories, with a heightened sense of interconnectedness. He sees things simply as they are, without the added layers of meaning and judgment.
Could a life without those constant mental narratives be more peaceful and enjoyable? It's a fascinating question to consider.
And it leads us to Wright's final concept, the view from nowhere. This is a perspective of impartiality and interconnectedness that transcends individual biases and even the agendas that evolution has programmed into us.
It's like stepping outside of our limited perspective and seeing the world from a more objective viewpoint.
And this view from nowhere isn't about becoming indifferent. It's actually about cultivating an even distribution of concern for all beings, challenging the evolutionary imperative to prioritize our own interests above all else.
So it's not about denying our individual needs and desires, but recognizing that everyone else has those same needs and desires and extending our compassion to include them.
Exactly. This is where the potential for positive change lies. If we can cultivate this view from nowhere, we can start to break down the barriers of tribalism and us versus them thinking that cause so much conflict in the world.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the illusion of happiness and the modular mind to the not-self experience and the view from nowhere. It's been a fascinating journey through the intersection of Buddhism, science, and our own personal experience.
And it's an ongoing journey. There's always more to explore, more to learn, and more to practice. But by engaging with these ideas, we can start to question our assumptions, expand our perspectives, and ultimately live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
If you're intrigued by these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Robert Wright's book, Why Buddhism Is True. It's a thought-provoking exploration of how ancient wisdom and modern science can come together to offer us a new way of understanding ourselves and the world around us. And who knows, it might even inspire you to try out meditation for yourself and see what insights you can uncover. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.